Craft Bonanza and remaining an active general aviation pilot. Member Weiner earned all three of his academic degrees in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan. Let's welcome Dr. Weiner.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Is the sound on? Good, thank you. Let me start by saying I'm delighted to be back here again. I realized the presentation last year had the same title, but you're not going to see exactly the same stuff. I've got some interesting material, I think, to get a better understanding of where the challenges are in general aviation, as well as a bit of insight into what the NTSB does. So let me start off by introducing a member of the family. I'd like to take this opportunity to show 6529 Romeo. For those of you who are very sharp vision, you'll notice my hair color is a little different. It wasn't that I had it colored then, but that was 10 years plus ago when we got the airplane. I've used that picture because I had a lot more hair and it was a lot darker. So I've been an avid general aviation pilot. We've taken 29 Romeo down here twice. Unfortunately, this year didn't work out to take her down here. Let me start by giving a few words about the NTSB. And I'm going to cover more information about the NTSB because I think when I read some of the news accounts, some of the industry material, I realize that we are not entirely understood in terms of what our mission is. We're a relatively small, independent federal agency, and our role is to determine the probable cause of aviation accidents, all the aviation accidents, and significant accidents in other means of transportation. We also do safety studies, but based on investigations and safety studies, we put out recommendations aimed at eliminating transportation accidents. What I'm going to cover today is take a look at the general aviation accident trends and see where we are going and where we've come from over the last decade plus. The NTSB has no regulatory authority. We can't make anybody do anything. So what we do is basically advocacy work. We try to use opportunities like this, opportunities to showcase what we call a most wanted list. And that most wanted list is of 10 items. 5 items have direct relationship to general aviation. Then I'll talk a little bit about our mission at the NTSB and wrap up by giving you some insight into how the investigation process for general aviation actually works. So let me start out by showing you all general aviation accidents over the last 12, 13 years. These are the non-fatal accidents, and the red are the fatal accidents. So you see we've gone from roughly 1,900 accidents down to around 1,200 accidents in 2013. And I've got a little more data for 2014 in just a moment. That looks like a good news story, but we'll address what happens when you make a rate out of that, when you divide it by an estimate of what the hours of flying are. In terms of fatalities, have gone down from roughly 600 fatalities to less than 400 fatalities over that 13-year period. So 2013, we actually had just shy of 1,300 total accidents. This is in aviation. In terms of general aviation, we had 1,224 accidents, 22 of which were fatal, with 390 fatalities. So how does that compare to 2014? 2014, in terms of total accidents, we went down about 30 accidents. In terms of fatal accidents, however, we went up. Looking just at general aviation accidents, we went down, but fatal accidents went up. So it's hard to say that there's a trend here. Some goes down, some going up. Last year, we had 405 fatalities in general aviation. Now, if I make a rate out of this, so I take the number of accidents divided by the number of flight hours. For fatal accidents, we have just a little more than one accident per 100,000 flight hours. And if you look at that, I wouldn't call it a curve, it's pretty flat. It ends pretty well where it started. In terms of the overall accidents, it went down a bit in 2013. If I start to break this down into segments of the industry, here's that average for all accidents that I showed you a moment ago. Started at 6, ended up at a little below 6 in 2013. If I look at corporate, that's down on the bottom. Now, for the most part, corporate operations are with a twin-engine aircraft. It's probably a turbine aircraft, probably flown by 2 pilots, probably 2 pilots requiring or encountering recurrent training because the insurance requirements require it. So that looks a lot like an airline operation, and the accident rate is very much the same. If I look at business flying being defined as operations in pursuit of business, but not by somebody who's been paid to be a professional pilot. So whoever's flying the airplane may be the owner of the airplane, may be the owner of the business, may be somebody who works for the business whose job is not necessarily to be the company pilot. If I look at instructional flying, that's a little bit below average. Now, given this isn't Lake Wobegon, where everybody's above average, if I look at personal flying, that's the accident rate. And it's going up, not down. It's gone from 10 accidents per 100,000 flight hours, in other words, 1 for every 10,000 flight hours, up to 12. And if I do the same thing for fatal accidents, here's that fatal accident rate, starting a little bit above 1, ending a little bit closer to 1. Some years we don't even have a fatal accident in corporate flying. Business flying has, although it's got its ups and downs, has generally gone down. Instructional flying is right in there with business flying, and not a surprise because most instructional flying has a commercial rated pilot in the right seat. So that leaves personal flying going from just below 2 accidents to almost 2.5 accidents per 100,000 flight hours. So that's really the challenge. Now, if I look at what kind of accidents those are, these are for all Part 91 GA operations, loss of control in flight, and I'll talk more about that. System component failure, power plant failure, in other words, is number 2 position. CFIT, controlled flight into terrain, is number 3. Collision with something else, but not a controlled flight into terrain. And then VFR, encounter with IMC. This is the VFR into IMC category. And finally, out of the top 6, again, system and component failure, but not power plant. So we put GA on the most wanted list for a number of reasons. This is its 3rd year on the most wanted list. Over the last decade plus, we've tended to investigate more than 1,500 GA accidents per year. Overall, the GA rate is flat, but hasn't improved much over the last decade. Interestingly, the airline Part 121 operations have gone down by more than 80% over that time. And the reason for that is government and industry has been working together closely in an activity called the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, CAST. And it's been a process basically looking at the data for accidents, identifying where the risk lies, identifying all of the things that could be done to reduce that risk, mitigate that risk, and then select out of that those things that actually can be done and actually will have a safety benefit when completed. So that process is being ported over, has been ported over into the General Aviation side. It's called the Joint Steering Committee, GAJSC. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But there is plenty of targets. It's a target-rich environment for GA safety. As I said, the personal flying accident rate has increased over 20% in the last 10 years, 25% if you look at the fatal. So GA needs attention. As I said at the outset, the NTSB can't make anybody do anything, so we use tools like the most wanted list. 10 items, they get redone every year. We try to find those items which will materially make a difference if we're successful, and something that can be accomplished in a year or 2 years. So that list, and we'll talk about disconnect from deadly distractions. We'll talk about substance impairment in transportation. The last session before this dealt with, to some extent, helicopter safety. We cover all modes of transportation, so train control is an area we've been pushing hard for many years. Rail tank car safety, we've been hearing a lot over the last several years about crude by rail and the hazards of that. Transit, then the general aviation, prevent loss of control of flight into terrain, or loss of control, I should say. We'll talk about fitness for duty and procedural compliance. So out of that 10, 5 have a direct relationship to general aviation. So let me start with distractions. Distractions are a problem in any of the modes of transportation. You hear a lot about texting while driving, cell phone use, talking while driving. We find, have had accidents in all of the modes of transportation. It may take the form of a tugboat operator working on his PC and running over another vessel. It can take the form of a train engineer, a train operator, texting and running smack dab into a freight train, another freight train. It can take the form of, if you remember a few years back, Northwest Flight 188, where the 2 pilots were busy on a personal computer, overflew Minneapolis. So there are a variety of different ways. In aviation, the emphasis is on sterile cockpit. Now, for 121 operators, that means everything below 10,000 feet is focused on the mission. A lot of us don't much get over 10,000 feet, so that doesn't really apply per se, but anytime you have a high cockpit workload, an approach in the airport area, right after takeoff, paying attention to flying the airplane and maybe telling your passengers to just hold on a moment while you get everything under control is a good idea. In the world of automobile transportation, we take a pretty strong line at the NTSB about talking on cell phones, even if they might be hand-free. We, as a matter of policy, discourage the use of portable electronic devices. Now, in terms of general aviation, if I had to get rid of my iPad in ForeFlight, that would be a problem. But really, it's the appropriate use of PEDs that we're after. So manage distractions. Let me move to the second subject, impairment, and specifically in substance impairment in transportation. Again, this is a factor in all modes of transportation. But we did a study in aviation, mainly because the other modes of transportation don't have very good data. Automobile accidents happen, fatalities happen, but not in many cases does the accident investigated from the perspective of was there some sort of substance impairment. So we finished a study about September last year, where because all fatal accidents, we endeavored to take tissue samples and find out if there was some sort of medication in the pilot, and specifically in the pilot. CAMI, the Civil Aeromedical Institute, has the ability to look for 1,300 different substances or metabolites of substances. And in about 80+% of the cases of a fatal accident, tissue samples are able to be investigated in this way. So we had a study that went from 1999, or 2000 rather, through 2012, I'm sorry, 1990 through 2012. And that study showed that if we look at potentially impairing drugs in fatally injured pilots, if we break it into the first 7 years, 11% of the pilots had some potentially impairing drug in their system. More recently, that's gone to 23%. What that looks like is this. And the red line is potentially impairing drugs. The green line is potentially impairing conditions, or in other words, we found a drug that was associated with some sort of medical condition that was potentially impairing. Then the purple line is controlled substances, and the bottom is illicit drugs. But you can see we've gone for potentially impairing drugs from about 11% up to 23% over that 22-year period. If I can get this to move. Interestingly, in about 8% of the cases, one drug stands out. Diphenhydramine. It's a very common antihistamine. I first got acquainted with diphenhydramine when we were talking about shipping dogs across the country, taking them on board in a carrier. And I asked the vet about how do you kind of just calm them down? He said, give them a little Benadryl. Look at all of the products that contain diphenhydramine. It's hard to get away from it. In a study of driving while impaired, it was found that diphenhydramine has about the same impairment characteristics as 0.1 blood alcohol limit, which is already over the 0.08 limit. These are all available over the counter. And most pilots have no idea how impairing these particular medications can be. The typical dosing interval for these is roughly 6 to 8 hours. And the FAA says that you should allow 5 times the dosing interval for this system, for this particular product to get metabolized out of the system. So you're talking about a day or more after taking diphenhydramine, or any one of these sleeping allergy products. I don't have the slides tracking. Is there somebody who could give me a hand here?
Push that button again, try that again.
This one isn't tracking.
It's right there.
I've hit the slides presentation. How it should work.
Here we
There we
go.
go. Okay.
Thank you. This is what you see on the back of the package. And it's in very small type. When using this product, marked drowsiness may occur. Avoid alcoholic drinks. Alcohol, sedatives, and tranquilizers may increase drowsiness. Be careful when driving a motor vehicle or operating machinery. And the last one really makes me chuckle. Excitability may occur, especially in children. So you're either drugged and sedated or you're excitable. So again, we're trying to make sure that people understand, particularly the pilot community understands the risks of taking some of these over-the-counter drugs. One of the things we did in our study was take a look at findings by certificate. And again, here's the 4 different kinds of categories: potentially impairing drugs, impairing conditions, controlled substances, and illicit drugs. And the more dependent you are on earning your living by flying, the less likelihood you are to be using these drugs or having potentially impairing drugs in your system. If we take a look at by certificate, we find that if you have no medical certificate, you tend to have more drug use. I know there's a big discussion going on about the third-class medical. And so if we look at this from a risk reduction perspective, we need to do something with the situation where we don't have a medical to reduce the use of impairing drugs. So some of the things that we in the community are pushing are this material in the FAA publications. Medications in Flying is for the layman. The Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners is not written for the layman. AOPA has member resources. But getting back to this Joint Steering Committee, the GAJSC, the first real study that the GAJSC did was on loss of control, but in the process of studying accidents and loss of control is where we found the prevalence of potentially impairing drugs in the accident victims, the pilots. That led to a 2013 letter from the FAA to pilots basically saying, pay attention to the over-the-counter drugs and the effects that they may have. And last year we took some initiatives that included developing a drug database through this GAJSC, as well as a training course that the AOPA has put together and is about ready to go online with it, be available to members, non-members as well. So this is a means to mitigate some of the risks that we see of not having this either 2 years, 5 years conversation with a medical examiner, your chance to talk about what sort of issues do come with flying. Now, on a related topic, fitness for duty, require medical fitness for duty, and again, this is a factor in all the modes. The airman medical exam that we're all familiar with does assess fitness, but only really the fitness at exam time. But your flying, of course, is not during the exam time, which requires pilots to be able to self-assess fitness. So before every flight, you should take a close look at, am I really fit to fly? Have I had any medical issues? Have I had any drug issues? Do I have an elevated stress level for any reason? So that's appropriate for flight preparation. As well, we focus on medical conditions. It's interesting to look at some of the other modes of transportation. The number of times that we find obstructive sleep apnea. We've had pilots going to sleep. We've had train operators going to sleep. We've had truck drivers, particularly truck drivers, falling asleep. There's no mode of transportation that is immune from obstructive sleep apnea. I know the FAA tried to roll out a policy change a couple of years ago, and that's perhaps in a much more useful vein at the moment. There are markers that can be identified for likelihood of obstructive sleep apnea. What we're really focusing on is enhanced medical knowledge. We would like pilots to be better equipped to make their own self-assessments, have a better understanding of what to do and what not to do with regard to fitness for duty. Let me move to the fourth subject, I should say, procedural compliance. Strengthen procedural compliance. Now, this one is on the most wanted list because if we go back over the last 10 years, we've got a dozen major accidents with large transports where procedural compliance was an issue. As far as procedural compliance, there's nothing unique to the Part 121 operators, although that's where the focus is at this point, but it's equally appropriate and applicable to corporate and business operators. It's really applicable to general aviation operators as well, although we often tend to not be as procedural. We don't use procedures to the same extent. We should. Our accident rate would improve greatly if we did have some practical procedures. But again, the issue is you have to have practical procedures. So our focus here is on identifying well-developed procedures. In other words, procedures that when somebody takes a look at them, you don't get this answer, well, that's not the way we do it here. Procedures should represent the way you do it. Then you should train to those procedures and then fly according to the procedures. So emphasize and reinforce operations to those procedures. Now let me get to the most meaty one for this particular discussion, loss of control. Prevent loss of control in flight in general aviation. Our early look at it through the JASC, the Joint Steering Committee, identified 40% of GA accidents were loss of control for that 10-year period. If we look at it for the few later years, that actually goes up from 40 to about 44% if we take into account 2011 through 2014. So that's obviously a target-rich environment. It's the most deadly of the flight phases: approach to landing, maneuvering, and initial climb out. Without bothering you or inundating you with a lot of data, but I like data because it really tells a story. If I look at business flying for that 2008 through 2013, it's really a 6-year period. There were 18 loss of control accidents, 9 CFIT accidents, and then the rest are smaller numbers. If I look at instructional flying, and of course through the magic of Excel, the scale keeps changing, but you can see we went from 18 to 59 accidents, loss of control in flight, and it's by far, far greater than any of the other loss of control categories for instructional flying. But the situation gets even more striking when I go to personal flying, and now that loss of control bar is 521 accidents. That's a lot of accidents. That's basically 100 of those a year, or 1 every 3 days. The rest of them kind of pale in comparison. System component failure, power plant failure, is just a little over 20% of this loss of control bar. Now, lest you think, I put them all on the same scale so that you see the relative size of personal flying, the 521, and lest you think it is a general aviation only problem. This is from Boeing's statistical summary of large transport accidents. The bar on the far left is not quite the same dimension, it's number of fatalities, but you can see it is almost double of the next closest bar, which is CFIT. So if for personal flying, loss of control is a big issue, and instructional flying, it's a big issue. And business flying and corporate flying and airline flying all have loss of control as the number one. I borrowed this from Paul Cox's presentation on loss of control he gave yesterday, or the day before yesterday. And you can see, looking at the red bars, maneuvering, the red bars are fatals. So maneuvering has 237 fatal accidents, and this was a 2008 to 2014? Yeah, 2008 through 2014. So if you could address maneuvering, approach, and initial climb, you could really reduce the number of fatal accidents quite a bit. He also had another very interesting slide. If you look around the airport proper and look at the pattern and the approach from the left and departure on the to the right, the initial climb has 127 accidents. The approach, VFR or IFR, has 55 accidents. Go around has 44 accidents. Takeoff, 41 accidents. Final 30 accidents. You really can concentrate that initial climb, the final stages of approach, and what surprised me was the problems with missed approaches and go-arounds. A lot of people are not prepared to make a go-around. That's a good reminder to make sure, as on short final, that you've really configured the airplane to go around. In particular, if you trim heavily on approach, you'll find yourself in a position of when you apply power, and in a go-around situation, you'll have to really push hard on the nose to keep the nose from popping up on you. It's a good argument for do only moderate trimming in pitch on short final. So the Joint Steering Committee addressed this about early 2011, 2012, put out the loss of control working group's product on approach and landing. And as I said earlier on, the CAST process was to envision all of the things that would solve the problem and then go through them and identify those things that you can do that are practical and that would make a difference if you did them. So the last thing you want to do is something that is hard to do and doesn't make much difference. The easy things to do that make a lot of difference have already been done. That's the low-hanging fruit. So they came out with 28 safety enhancements. Angle of attack information. That's for new airplanes, current airplanes, and retrofit. And I'll talk more about that because that's a big swinger. But ADM showed up, stabilized approach, single pilot CRM, medication effects. This is where we basically initially tripped over the medication issue. Weather technologies and more. As I said, they go on to 28 different safety enhancements. The nice thing about these safety enhancements are somebody owns each one of these safety enhancements. There's schedules for when, there's plans for what gets done. This is what has made the process so successful for the commercial side. So focusing on angle of attack displays, without getting too far into Aero 101, wing stalls at the same angle of attack for a given configuration. And by configuration, I mean flaps. So as you look at this lift curve, CL versus angle of attack slope, you can see at the top where it starts to bend over, that's CL max. That's where the stall occurs for a wing section. The nice thing about angle of attack information is it is independent of airspeed. The wing always stalls at the same angle of attack, but that doesn't necessarily mean the same airspeed. You can have an accelerated stall where you're pulling a G load. You can have airplane weight changes, which cause different stalls at different speeds. So that's the value of angle of attack. Now, for people who've learned to fly in the military, particularly in the Navy, they live by angle of attack. They almost ignore airspeed in the pattern. There are a number of devices available, particularly for the experimental amateur built aircraft. And it was interesting to find that if we looked at products that were for the EAB market versus the same sort of products but certified, and it put in a certified airplane, there was more than a 10-to-1 cost difference. So for about $800 or $1,000 of parts, you could put an angle of attack indicator in an EAB, but the same sort of system was $10,000 to $12,000. So this doesn't make a lot of sense when you're talking about safety equipment. Why should it be so hard to put safety equipment on board an airplane? This led to a lot of good discussion, and in fact, the FAA installation policy got changed in the process. So the assumption was if you had a safety piece of gear like angle of attack indicator, and with it on board the airplane, you had a safer airplane than without it, and that could be installed without interfering with and wasn't required for operating the airplane, then why not allow the installation? It's been a challenge to get everybody on the FAA side to understand that, but that has led to an angle of attack system with the indicators and the equipment built at FAASTeam standards, much like the light sport. It can be installed as a minor mod and signed off as a logbook entry. So that we think is a success, and it is the first of probably more safety equipment that will be able to be installed on certified aircraft built to FAASTeam standards. So I would be remiss without emphasizing stall recovery, because when I was learning to fly, the process was to demonstrate all of the different kinds of stalls. There was little emphasis on recovering from the stalls. The emphasis was on doing the stalls. And in fact, that is SSA. That's ass backwards. So in a stall recovery, don't try to power through. Reduce the angle of attack, unload the wing, get the wing flying again. So then you've got control of the airplane. Then you level of wings, adjust the thrust so that you don't put yourself into a highly accelerating downward trajectory. So avoid overspeed and high G levels, and bring the airplane back to level flight. As I said, don't try to power out of a stall. As I said, when I was learning to fly, it was the minimum loss of altitude, so you hung on the edges of stall for some extended period of time while trying to power out of it. But that's really very close to the entry for a spin. That will get you a spin if you mismanage it. So that's my emphasis on loss of control. Loss of control is addressed in the safety alerts that we've put out 2 years ago, and I'd just like to basically promote these 5 that came out about 2 years ago. While I'm at it though, a safety alert related to mistrim came out about 3 days ago, and it's really a novel one in the sense that there was an airplane in for maintenance. A highly experienced mechanic managed to rig the trim tab backwards. The pilots who were checking the airplane out were fast learners. They managed to learn faster than their luck ran out, so they recovered the airplane. All the parties were willing to sit down and talk about what happened, what got them into that situation, what were the thought patterns. So that's available on the NTSB website. And my understanding is in 24 hours, we had 44,000 hits on it. So let me move to the next subject, and that is the role of the NTSB. And again, I would like to cover this because it's not well understood. We cover all modes of transportation: aviation, railroad, highway, marine, pipeline, and hazardous materials. We ordinarily have 5 board members. At the moment, we have 4. Chris Hart is our chairman. He was just confirmed about a month ago. Bella Denzar is the new board member, and she's been made vice chairman. The board members are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, serve on rotating 5-year terms. So every year, somebody's term runs out. And we're on fixed terms to help keep us out of the political process so that we are much more resistant to pressure to resign if somebody doesn't like what we've done. So this is the mission. I've kind of covered this at the beginning, but we're a relatively small agency. I might like to kind of characterize our agency in terms of, if you will, our aeronautical or general aviation DNA. About 3 years ago, in concert with EAA, we did a study on experimental amateur-built aircraft. And one of the things we did in the process was took a look within the NTSB at how many people were building airplanes, how many people had built airplanes, or had restored airplanes, and we found 32 airplanes. Then we asked the question, how many people own airplanes? And another 16 airplanes popped up. So that's almost 50 airplanes in a 400 person organization. So when people get suspicious of what's the NTSB's motive, well, we are general aviation rich. And that doesn't address the number of people who are pilots who rent, borrow, steal other people's airplanes in the process, but don't own one themselves. So as I said, we cover aviation, surface transportation. As a digression here, this was the first accident that I went on scene as a new board member back in 2010. And I mentioned distraction. If you look behind the cab, underneath the front end of that school bus that's up in the air, there is a GMC pickup truck rolled up in a ball. And it was driven by about a 19-year-old who was texting at the time. The accident sequence was one of the truck came to a stop in a construction zone. The guy texting, driving the pickup, never hit the brakes, rolled into the back of that pickup, into the back of the tractor there. 2 school buses coming up the road. A motor coach was ahead of them. The motor coach saw the accident happen, pulled off to the side, immediately got out, tried to wave the school bus drivers over, or wave them to slow down. They interpreted it as a move over a lane, so they went into the left-hand lane. And as soon as they got past the motor coach, they pulled it back into the right-hand lane, and being distracted by the person on the side of the road, they didn't stop. They hit the brakes at the last minute, hit the back of the pickup truck, rolled it up, and you can see where the buses ended up. So the driver of the pickup truck was a fatality. There was a young lady sitting in the back of the first bus on that on the right-hand corner, and that was another fatality. So this is where we encounter our emphasis on distracted driving. Distracted driving is not just cell phones. Distracted driving is the person in the other seat, it's the kids in the back, it's the trying to put on makeup, it's the eating while driving, all kinds of distraction. We also do ships, rail. So our responsibility is to determine probable cause. We issue recommendations aimed at preventing the accidents, but we also do safety studies. So basically we use investigations and safety studies to learn about what it is that we should recommend to be done within the community to prevent this kind of accident from happening again. We use some other tools, forums and symposiums, to get the right people together to discuss things. We also act as the accredited U.S. representative for foreign accidents that involve U.S. equipment, U.S. operators, or U.S. citizens. The official civil aviation accident database that I keep using is an NTSB database. Those that you see from AOPA, for example, are modifications or refinements to our database. We also look at emergency response, provide family assistance, and for those of you who ever find yourself getting a citation of the wrong kind from the FAA and you contest it, you may find yourself before an NTSB administrative law judge. Now, the investigation process, we launch a GO team. If we launch a GO team from the headquarters, a full GO team has a board member as the public spokesman, an investigator in charge, a number of technical specialists, public affairs, and family affairs specialists should the families and friends and victims of the victims need help. So that can be a process where we arrive on scene, we coordinate with the local law enforcement, find out what investigative resources we need, put an ops center together. The first responders are almost always the local law enforcement authorities. We have to arrange for security of the site to continue, and in many cases there is some sort of biohazard available or to be encountered. On scene, we have an organization meeting managed by the investigator in charge. The process then is designed to identify the investigative groups that need to be involved, who at the NTSB ought to be involved, organize the groups. I'll talk about our party process in just a moment, but we depend heavily on technical expertise from people like the airframe manufacturers, the engine organizations in terms of large transport accidents, the labor unions, and so forth. We provide briefings as often as we can with factual information. We avoid speculation. We constantly are asked, why does it take a year to do an investigation? But that's often because the investigation starts out by gathering facts on scene, then moves to facts gathering as we work through at headquarters, and then do analysis and come up with the probable cause and the findings. So after we're on scene, here you see flight data recorders being taken apart. So that leads to the findings and probable cause, and the draft report then goes to the board for their review and buy-in. So just to finish this off, I'd like to show you what is a little more directly related to general aviation. In terms of civil aviation accidents, we investigate fatal, non-fatal, mid-air, and public use. Public use meaning fire department, or rather law enforcement organizations that have a helicopter, Forest Service. These are accidents that happen to vehicles that are not in the purview of the FAA. Our staffing, as I said, is we at the moment are about 420 some employees. The biggest part of our organization is in fact the aviation, and we have 4 regional aviation offices with about 50 regional investigators. So if you have an aircraft accident and it's a fatal accident, these are the people you're going to meet. As you can see, we have Seattle, Denver, Ashburn, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area, and Anchorage, Alaska, which are our regional headquarters. If you get to Washington, D.C., LaFont Plaza, which is right on the metro stop, you're welcome to stop by and say hi. We have a 24-hour command central, command operation, or response operations center is now the name of it. Used to be called a comm center. So this, if you have a reportable accident, is where you start. It's manned 24 hours a day. It's in contact with the National Response Center. It monitors all of the news feeds. So let me just briefly talk about the kinds of investigations we do. One of the problems we have with general aviation is we keep seeing the same accidents over and over again. Some of these are what would be aeronautically compared to the fender benders, no fatalities, known circumstances. We can interview the pilot by phone. So in these cases, we don't send an investigator. The FAA generally does our data gathering for us, and we determine the probable cause, but there's no preliminary report. So this is the aeronautical fender bender. A limited accident investigation is a little more serious. We have no fatalities, but we do a pilot interview, and we may or may not travel to the scene. Generally, this is an accident that is the result of mechanical issues that are better or well understood. A field investigation is one where we have fatalities, either crew or passengers. And in most cases, we have an investigator or investigators that will travel to the scene. I mentioned that we do family assistance. If necessary, transportation disaster assistance personnel will support the investigator in charge. For a major accident, major field investigation, and the picture that you see here is the Ted Stevens accident in Alaska of about 4 years ago, where there were multiple fatalities, very much a strong public and media interest. So in this case, a GO team with a board member was sent. Chairman Hersman at the time was the board member on scene. For a major investigation, and what you see here is the UPS crash in Birmingham, Alabama of about 2 years ago. In that case, we send a full team, and that can be as many as 20 people with an investigator in charge and a board member. I mentioned the party process. With 400 technical expertise, our technical expertise is necessarily limited since we do all of the various modes of transportation. But we get involved people from the manufacturers, from the operators, from involved parties who can provide us with expertise. We invite these people in. We avoid, well, typically these parties include the FAA, the air carrier, airframe manufacturer, and the engine manufacturer, and we don't involve news media, media relations, attorneys, consultants, insurance personnel. In other words, we stay with the technical, stay with the data gathering, stay with the data, stay as close as we can to a real objective investigation. So if you had an accident, the first people that you meet, well, the first people who get involved are the owners of the vehicle, the first responders. Second hour, we start putting together teams, start to involve the FAA in the area, get the engine and the airframe manufacturers involved, and offer party status. So we get organized very early with the parties. So in a regional investigation, it would be the NTSB investigator, the FAA investigator, airframe and engine, And a party member can plan on being on scene for about 3 days. That may involve taking an engine apart, boxing it up, sending it back to the manufacturer for a teardown, documenting the wreckage, doing interviews, all to determine the facts, circumstances of the accident. So let me finish by a quotation, and it's from a championship bridge player, but it's really appropriate. Learn all you can from the mistakes of others. You won't have time to make them all yourself. I paraphrase that for this kind of situation to say you won't live long enough to do them all yourself. So that information is available on the NTSB website, ntsb.gov. There's a wealth of information, accident reports, dockets that have a great deal of ancillary information, all available online. The dockets have the factual reports, interviews, photographs, weather studies, radar tracks, and so forth. So let me finish by saying, Doug Adams, who was the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, said human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experience of others are also remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. So thank you very much.